So, Kaiso turned 4 years old last month, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the thinking that we've done in engaging in politics around sexuality, sexual diversity, gender diversity, in that framework. Yes, sir? So I'm going to run through a few things and spend a little time at the end talking about a revitalized regional formation. So I think other folks have made these points that politics are about values, they're about a particular analysis, they're about issues of difference and power. And in LGBTI work, how we understand that power, how we critique that power, and how we engage with power and change are critical questions. Kaiso formulated when we began to respond to the visit of an ex-gay ministry from California, what we stood for, because we wanted to educate and mobilize people who were involved in that response. And we began developing these 10 ideas that we've refined since. And we call our values. And the first of all is that you have to understand the world in order to change it, that you have to have analysis and strategy and not do activism by VAPs. We had a training called I Am a Citizen at the end of last year, and people said, we want to inflect that a little bit and we want to talk about the value of intuition in addition to analysis. The work we're doing is indigenous and it's imaginative and it's unorthodox and it's not replicating the work that comes to us from the North. That nationalism and nation building are a core part of how we engage, that we want to build a nation, we must participate in a nation, and that we must participate politically, including participating in political parties, because that's how politics happens. And sexuality is precious and essential and part of human dignity, and so is gender. That we own our own bodies, and Crystal talks about this notion of sexual citizenship. This is a very interesting and potentially controversial thing, that rather than rejecting this notion that faith and sexuality are in conflict, that many LGBTI people are people of faith, and that faith can be a tool both for oppression and for liberation. That we share things in common with other people who are not LGBTI. And that within the communities, as Rosa's presentation highlights, there's diversity, and that some people are given less authority and less value than others. That we have power, that change is possible, that optimism is critical to activism, that very often we're portrayed as these nations of hopelessness, these places in the world that are backward, that won't change, and young people who experience rejection in their families and the sense that their bodies and their sexuality are horrible and damning go on the internet, and they see these representations of their nations as these places of hopelessness. And that doesn't help anybody do organizing, and that very often we adopt these notions of victimization and pathology to mobilize resources and attention, and that may not be a productive way to organize. That the notion of organizing is coming together to do things that we can't do by ourselves. A former diplomat in Trinidad and Tobago, in a meeting with us once, said she'd noticed that in Trinidad and Tobago, one parent of an autistic child was an NGO. And it's very much pushing back against that notion. And lastly, incrementalism, that you want to change the things you can change first. And I've added in this idea that, you know, their whole focus globally around decriminalization. Yeah, well, we can remove the laws, but at the end of the day, we don't remove the Bible or the Quran, and they're more strategic targets for change and activism. So I want to talk a little bit about Kaiso's fabulous logo that Liam Resende designed, and all of the interpretations we've layered on it, in addition to the ones it came with originally. And at its center is this notion of embedding Trinidad and Tobago in the palm of one's hand, the notion of leaving a mark on the nation, of lifeline, of destiny, the voting finger that symbolizes political engagement, the raised hand symbolizing inclusion and volunteering and wanting to be counted and wanting to be dependable, wrapped in both the red, white, and black and the rainbow colors. But also this narrative that we have, that's a story that came out of a protest in San Francisco against media coverage where workers at the newspaper that was being picketed threw printer's ink on demonstrators who then left handprints with the printer's ink around the city, and that actually was taken up. The purple hand was one symbol along with the rainbow flag and the lambda and other issues that was one of the more historical symbols that got globalized around LGBT issues. CAISO developed a policy agenda. We thought we were fabulous and that we were going to have an impact on the last general election. And we developed 6 and 6, and we gave it to every political leader. And we went to rallies and we had brochures that talked about our issues. People were very polite. Some handed them politely back to us, but there were no quarrels. Some people actually thought we were homophobic and then got angry with us because they thought we were, and then told us they were going to meet their girlfriend later. So, and there were 6 key issues we imagined a government would do in 6 months. Well, we learned some political lessons. We focused on government leadership and building government capacity, the notion of simply speaking out, speaking up on these issues. The notion of the governments, despite political will, have to build capacity. That we wanted to put a desk in the gender ministry. We wanted sexual orientation and gender identity to be mainstreamed in training across the public service and in initiatives like masculinities and gender-based violence. But ultimately, that research and public debate and building technical capacity is key to this work. We had one legislative priority, which was what we thought was the easiest thing to do, around which there was broad political consensus and which wouldn't take political risk, and that was adding sexual orientation to the discrimination protections of the Equal Opportunity Act. We initially talked about other issues as a package, and we settled on a different package after 2010. Which was the notion of adding AIDS and HIV at the same time, because a human rights review of Trinidad and Tobago shortly after the EOA passed said these were the 3 things that were missing, and the government has introduced legislation to add the 2 and not sexual orientation. We talked a lot about social vulnerability, and that as an opening to highlight how a government can take leadership and initiative in ways that make these issues palatable, and we use it as a strategy. We recognize that talking about rights isn't always helpful, and often talking about social vulnerability is a way for a state to actually feel that it can act. And we talked about crime and policing and ways in which sensitizing police so that we're getting the same standard of access to justice, the same kinds of treatment, and not being called bullerman when we go to report bias violence in a police station. We've talked repeatedly about how bullying and education and discrimination in employment and family violence and sexual abuse in children's homes and a range of issues come together to fuel homelessness among young trans and gay and lesbian people, and that there needs to be a strategic intervention to deal with those issues. And we talked about some broader initiatives related to that upstream from the homelessness. We talked about the education sector, and we talked both about dealing with bullying in schools as well as using schools as sites of developing notions of citizenship that were about inclusion and teaching diverse masculinities, about male underachievement being driven by homophobia in schools. And we talked about preparing teachers to teach both about tolerance, but also helping them deal with competent education around sexuality and dealing with their own faith struggles. What are we doing? We started doing policy work primarily, and we reformulated our mission very recently into these 4 frames. One, dealing with discourse and consciousness, which is one of the things we think we've been most effective at doing. Having a discourse and showing up in public conversations in a way that transform people's imagination around sexual diversity and gender diversity, but also working on intersectionalities with other people who are working on rights and justice and nation building. We've recently undertaken a big initiative around regional and global South alliance building, working to be the secretariat of a revitalized regional movement and to develop links with emerging movements in Africa, in India, and throughout the rest of Latin America. We continue to focus on strategic ways to change public policy. We have a new campaign looking at the use of buggery laws to prosecute anal rape, even when there's a gender-neutral and orifice-neutral rape statute that isn't fair to either the victim or the accused, because consent never has to be proved, just sex. We're talking more about doing workplace policy work. We've emphasized a lot of our new work on the notion of building and deepening the work we do around community and actually taking on the notion of providing services and healing, as well as doing case advocacy for people to get justice and building a way to litigate from that, from the ground up, as opposed to from the top down. And doing political education, both in alliances as well as within our own communities, around the power to make change and that notion of coming together to make change. I added this at the last minute, and I'm going to rush through it very quickly, but there are links. Angel Gosain is trying to publish a book that has a chapter on our work, and I stole a little piece of it. This is just making us look good and using kind of big words. But it's this notion of bringing a post-colonial feminist, nationalist, sexual politics to the work, and the further slides will make that a little clearer. So it's this notion of nation being generative and inclusive, not patriarchal nationalism, not old world nationalism, but this notion of a feminist nationalism. And resisting the imposition of strategy and direction from the North, this notion of gay internationalism that paints the world as having this unified relationship to sexuality and gender and power, and looking at ways in which we are inventing, in which our interests may be different from those of people in other locations, but also may be similar to people in other locations, particularly in the South. And it's a strategic nationalism. This is a piece on Kaiso in the Theorizing Homophobias collection, and if you want to find it, that's where it is. Kaiso kind of launched ourselves in a lot of ways through a speech at the Family Planning Association's launch of its sexual rights, its International Federation Sexual Rights Declaration. And it was this notion of linking the struggle around bodies, that sexuality and gender is, to other struggles for liberation and freedom in the Caribbean specifically, on this notion that freedom of bodies politically, freedom of bodies from slavery and indentureship, freedom of bodies from limits on expressive worship, and the Shouter Baptists are all linked. Freedom of bodies in terms of, or labor riots, and Labor Day celebrates the immolation of a policeman. And this notion of bodies and how you link the struggle for sexuality and gender expression to this ongoing struggle, series of intertwined struggles around freeing bodies. That's the post-colonial Caribbean project. And this is a critique that the Commonwealth Advisory Bureau published of this notion that the global north knows what's best for us, and they're going to tell us, and that there's a particular trajectory that we need to take in our liberation that others have taken, because that's the way that liberation happens. And it frames this notion that instead of trying to lead the global movement, that people who really want to support work that we're doing in places like Trinidad and Tobago, instead of always trying to drive the car, need to get behind and push. And this, if you want to look at it, was actually an event that happened in the shadow of the Israeli apartheid controversy at Toronto Pride, where Andil facilitated a conversation between a Palestinian activist and me. There's some really sort of interesting dialogues with both of us that you can follow. Quickly, we're now the Secretariat for a regional movement building effort. We are leading the revitalization of a, how old is Cara Flags now? 16-year-old organization. And I'm going to skip through the history and talk a little bit about what that work involves. Similar to Kaiso's goals, it's about understanding what's going on regionally, specifically, helping create local level protective environments, again linking this notion of safety and support and healing, trying to build infrastructure and strengthen leadership, and to promote political participation and use of Caribbean institutions that advance human rights, that provide for justice. And this is anchored in 4 organizations across the region, located in Santo Domingo, Castries, Kingston, and here in Port of Spain. And for those of you who work in NGOs, there's a grant-making opportunity that will be launched in probably next week. And this tells you a little bit about what the focus will be. We focused on any kind of work happening in places where there's least development, and on lesbian, well, women who desire women, trans and intersex organizing in the rest of the region, including Trinidad and Tobago. So boys-only projects wouldn't be funded here. I hope I didn't go too much over 10 minutes. So.
Healing, the healing strategies, the community healing, what are the kinds of things that you've been doing, and whether, and how they've been going, what's working, what's not working, and so, what are some of the issues you're dealing with?
For a year now, we've been running a series of 10-week support group sessions in partnership with the psychiatry unit at our teaching hospital at Mount Hope. And I'm not sure how many cycles we've been through, but the group has been running for over a year. It's been gendered differently in each formation. There have been women who've come in different waves of the cycles. We try to do some families work that's not been particularly successful, using a similar model of self-help and kind of peer support with families. We did a podcast with recordings of a parent and LGBT children and a minister, a psychiatrist. We broadcast them on radio, and we gave parents a number to call, which they didn't. And we're trying to revive that work. More broadly, regionally, people are looking at ways to do kind of integrative work. Homelessness has been an enormous problem in Jamaica, in Kingston in particularly, where people are being pushed out of their families and communities, and it's become sort of a huge public policy issue that's all over the media, and the young people are uncontrollable and have wounded people who've offered them support. And so this is, that's another kind of healing strategy, and we're looking at ways to leverage international funding as a region to begin to deal with, if folks have read the papers, you see this pattern of the selective use of the loitering law in Trinidad and Tobago to prosecute young people on the street and address. St. Lucia has some experience doing work with homelessness in terms of building a shelter for LGBT and other populations, and we're looking at ways that we can do sort of holistic healing work with young people and develop some models by learning from each other across the region.
Mr. I did not get your name. Colin Robinson, thanks. I'm going to be a little tough on you. I see in your presentation, it says you have to understand the world in order to change it. Remember that? You feel you could change the world? Show me how you propose to do that. Name some sexual rights that you have, that gays have. Do we have a right to do as we please? Explain to me what is a person's right. Thank you.
Movements change worlds, and we're trying to build a movement. We have a long-term view. We also have a strategic view of what we can change first. And we really believe that adding sexual orientation to the Equal Opportunity Act can be done, that politically it's achievable. It's not about an I statement. It's about how people can come together to do that work. And that's how change has happened over the course of time. In terms of rights in Trinidad and Tobago specifically, it's a term that CAISO tends to use less than the notion of citizenship and the notions of equality, that we all should have the same notions of dignity and equality. We should all be entitled to those as citizens, but also as human beings. And there are laws in Trinidad and Tobago and social attitudes and practices that are sanctioned that prevent that. And the work essentially is to begin to change those attitudes by making appeals and building alliances and showing up as family members, as people in relationship to others, and having that transformative impact by working on other causes, marching for children's rights, marching for and supporting things that are about building a nation where we all should be able to live with the same set of services and entitlements, and if we want to use the word rights, and there was a thing, don't have a right to do as we please, and people who discriminate don't have a right to do as they please either. We've got to create a nation where everyone is treated with dignity similarly. And what people do in terms of the dignity of their sexuality, the dignity of their sense of their gender, should be precious and protected by the state. And people should be punished not for their sexual expression that's consensual or their gender expression, but they should be punished for preventing other people from accessing that aspect of their human dignity.
It occurs to me that carnival is a very sexual and sexualized thing, but it's very heterosexual. Do you see that as being as a kind of social mechanism for enforcing heteronormativity?
Well, one of the things that's interesting about carnival in Trinidad is that there's an over 200-year history of transvestism in it. So, but of course, again, that's allowed in a particular moment, in a particular fashion, and in many ways it actually mocks male femininity and working class black woman at the same time as it allows the person who's performing the mask to still be seen as a heterosexual gender normative man. So it's super complicated. It also at the same time, and in that same chapter I have a whole section where I talk about the Roba La Galina in Dominican Republic, which is very similar to Dame Lorraine, the Dame Lorraine Mass, so looking at Mother Sally in Barbados and so on. That these are times where in some places, so for instance in Puerto Rico, during Carnival, there are people who have been wanting to police and say no drag queens are allowed. But they also have a tradition of transvestism. So drawing that line between who are the traditional characters and who are the drag queens, again, is quite difficult. So it's a human desire to kind of want to define and delineate, but the actual delineation is quite difficult. So we tend to kind of create these rules and laws that then we just allow people to interpret. And that interpretation can actually be quite devastating and violent depending on who is doing it.
I mean, just to add a couple of things, I mean, Carnival's a jammed space. And so that kind of liminality creates lots of opportunities, I think, that yes, the sort of the codified sexuality is heterosexual, but there are lots of other spaces that people inhabit. And I think Jasmine Poir has written a little bit, who Beverly cited earlier, about the ways in which carnival spaces have expanded queer space in Trinidad and Tobago. A lot of that relates, in my mind, to the large numbers of returnees, LGBT returnees who come home for Carnival and create this Carnival economy that has had, I think, a historical role in actually expanding queer spaces in Trinidad and Tobago. And there's some fascinating things around market that happen in Carnival. Just as Iowa would run and sing in 10 Carnival Fete one night, he came to a gay party one year. And so there are interesting ways in which the Carnival economy can drive some of that crossing over. The question is how permanent it is. Then you have the phenomenon of the Bajans who come and walk up on each other in the Carnival band, in public, of the same sex, which we would never do because, you know, and similarly to the TNT. No, these are men. No, but that is, I mean, and Rosa can speak to this as well. I mean, the whole notion of male-male sexuality versus female-female kind of. Well, I'm arguing that that isn't a uniform reading of it. There are ways in which, when you flip the world over, and that there's spaces that get opened up around Carnival. In my experience, and I know that, you know, Poir has written about this as well, where kind of queerness comes out in different forms and fashions. And I think the whole notion of diaspora plays a critical role because people come home with the entitlement of citizens and the, I guess, protection of non-residents. So you could come home, you could play yourself, and then you have somewhere else to go back to.
The experience of liberation.
Right. And you come with a notion of sexual entitlement and all these sorts of things to your homeland. My sense is that they've helped in a small way to expand queer social spaces in Trinidad and Tobago that were always having to create themselves, if only to deal with this market of people who were coming.
So modern family probably has an impact for queer middle class life more than grassroots gay people, you know what I mean? So the carnival spaces that are born for grassroots people is very different from what people image in modern family. Yeah?
Yeah, no, I'm saying it's general acceptance, but yes, and let's face it, things don't change unless the middle class wants them to change. the middle class and the administration.
Growing up in Trinidad and Tobago, I love this country. I love it, love it. I love its people. I love so many things about it, maybe everything about it. But yet I feel like a pariah in my own country. And part of it is that the classification of people keeps putting people on the outside of everything. So I openly, in my columns and my show, would openly be pro-gay. And so as a result, people say, well, then you must be gay. So they place me outside. But then when it comes to the gay community, they place me outside because when I say to them, I'm not gay, they say, well, you must be confused. So they place me outside. So it's like everywhere I turn, I feel, and I'm talking as one person, but I know this is the voice of a lot of people in Trinidad and Tobago, you're being placed on the outside. So it's like a Nigerian man telling me at my age, over 40, that you are not a Douglas. because in his mind, a Dogla is somebody who is just a mixed person, which in Nigeria means a light-skinned person. But he doesn't know, and he's telling me this as a Trini. And so he himself, a foreigner, is placing me outside of my life, of my history, of what I know and love. And sometimes I worry, and I guess this is where the mapping thing, where the question raised about, well, how do we identify someone? Because my brain, I think, is probably the sexiest brain in the world, but I'm a very physically asexual person. I might not look it. I know what I look like sometimes, but... And how do we help each other define or embrace or be comfortable in ourselves when there's still so much of setting people outside of our arena? Because I mean, I not promoted, but I supported women's right to have safe legal abortion, supported the gay rights to love where they would, and so many people supported. And then there was a time in the media where I was literally ousted out of the media because of the things that I supported. And all of these people that I supported, there was nobody to support me, and I literally fell off the face of the earth for a long time, and I've been kind of like... And this is happening throughout our country to all sorts of talented, amazing people who could be forces, real legitimate forces of change and support for people who are suffering, what the gay and lesbian community, transgendered people, women who want the right to safe... And I think that, you know, he talked about the family, and I'm saying that we have to, as a country, look and see where the voices of change, the movers and shakers, the people who can and care and want to, are being lost. And so it's kind of just left for these little voices to kind of, the NGOs are doing something, but we have to look at the media. And I think that's what I want to come to, that our media, as a force of change, as a powerful agent, has totally gotten out of control, has gotten out of hand, has like lost sight of what it's supposed to be. And I think all of us need to come together and start demanding of the media, because if the media is the watchdog of the nation, of the politicians, of the man on the street, and everything in between, then if we could get the media on board to do its job, then less people would be inclined to do nonsense, to try to hurt people, to try to ostracize people. So I'm begging, please, wherever you see somebody in the media who is being a voice that is supporting what you're trying to do, please support them, give them the news, give them the whatever. This is just an appeal.